All right, so like we're on to week 2 here with the real framework and conversations developing the process for how we imagine real coming to life. How are we doing today?
Doing great. Excited
Yeah.
to continue the conversation.
Yeah, same. Last week we touched on just sort of where real is coming from for each of us personally and sort of the overall framework that we're thinking about. And just to kind of recap, a lot of this is an exploration of, you, Nick, being deep in flourishing science and the sort of different dimensions of human performance and human well-being. I was thinking originally about things like self-awareness, or we call them skill of self, but self-awareness, self-leadership, self-care were different acronyms we're using. And as we moved them into a real framework, so sort of a memorable framework, R took on the word resonance. And I wanted to kind of speak a little bit over that, but then just kind of go into what comes alive for you when we're talking about it. So, to me, resonance is, I think of us as channeling an energy at different points in time and sort of being different levels of aligned with who we naturally are and some of the different components of who we naturally are and then by extension of that who we oftentimes kind of move away from in different ways. And so when I think of self-awareness, when I think of resonance, things that come alive for me, things are, personalities, strengths, passions, attributes. There's the whole realm of archetypes, different things. But, I'd love to start just, Nick, with your own lived experience, coaching individuals, kind of working with them. When you think about concepts like resonance or self-awareness, what have you found to be some of the key interesting areas that are fertile for your clients, for you to explore?
Yeah, it's a good opening question. It's probably worth distinguishing a couple terms here
Yeah.
because we're going to talk about, I think, resonance in a really interesting way that'll bring up values and coherence and congruence and strengths and passions and all those sorts of things, right? There's a use of the word resonance out there, particularly in, let's say the physiological community, but it's also often applied to well-being, performance, whatever it might be. And I'm thinking of like some of the work by Leah Lagos. Resonance in that case refers to essentially maximizing heart rate variability, excuse me, through specific types of breathing patterns, which is then associated with all sorts of different outcomes, resilience, physical health, mental health, et cetera, high performance, right?
Right.
So we're not necessarily talking about that in that specific way. And so then to your question, to me, this is probably one of the most frequent challenges we have to help clients work through. They might come to us for performance stuff. They might come to us for well-being stuff, flourishing stuff, kind of whatever you want to call it. But a lot of times it is fundamentally rooted in what do you value, maybe versus what do other people value or society values or culture values, right? And are you living, behaving in ways that seems aligned, congruent, coherent with those like kind of core values, beliefs, and other things that are important to you, right? It's basically like, let's make sure you're not living somebody else's life
Right.
to a certain extent, right?
Right.
And a lot of times they may think they aren't. Oh no, I'm like I think I'm pretty self-aware. I think I'm doing things that I really deeply care about. And then when you start to maybe trust them about, okay, like what are the values? What are the priorities? What are the things you're proactively trying to do or the ways you're proactively trying to live? And understandably, many of them don't have answers because they've just never really been pressed to step back and think about it, right? They've just kind of been going day to day and just kind of like many of us do, picking things up as they experience them and learn them or hear them, right? But they don't always have that step back kind of meta reflective process of the things that they truly value and whether or not they're living those things.
Right. Yeah, we're actually currently embedding curriculum for real with one of our college partners, and they have a core focus on unearthing values really early in the career development, career discovery process. But it is really interesting how we don't have that meta view of ourselves, and we sometimes don't make explicit what we naturally live out implicitly, or we live differently from, depending on how you're going about things. Have
Hmm.
you found in that excavation process, when you sort of take a client and you focus in on values, is there a process that you run, or are there, diagnostic tools, or how do you get to sort of values it through exercise?
So many tools,
Yeah.
probably more than there needs to be. Sometimes there's a little bit of like muddying between strengths and values.
Hmm.
And I say that because some assessments think they're doing one or the other. Some assessments think they're doing both. So if we like separate those, for instance, like take the kind of the most famous taxonomy in positive psychology, it's BIA, right? Values in action, which they call strengths.
Interesting.
Okay, so if we try to separate those a little bit, in terms of process, I don't think there's one particular best process. But what we typically try to do is more or less put a list in front of somebody.
Hmm.
That might be that they take a survey via something else and that spits out a list. But more often than not, we're kind of putting something in front of them, maybe asynchronously, giving them time to sort of step back and say, okay, what is like most fundamental to me? And that's a key phrase. So for example, I was speaking to an old student over the last few weeks. We were talking about let's say, a particular geopolitical issue at the moment. And it became pretty clear early on that we were just coming at it from different values, right?
Mm.
So she, in this case, I think, and I tried to help her identify this, I think was really prioritizing values like loyalty, community, religion slash spirituality. I was looking at it and saying, well, I'm a little more interested in like perspective, knowledge, fairness, right? And as we're this is the reason I bring it up, as you're having that conversation, it doesn't mean she doesn't care about perspective, knowledge, and fairness. And
Right.
it doesn't mean I don't care about, community and loyalty and all those things. And that's why you've got to have people identify what is most core and fundamental. Because if you look at a big list of values, many people, I'd say most people, are going to look at it and say, well, I value almost all of those things.
Right.
Right. And understandably so. And what's most fundamental? How does it start to then shift by context? Right. Age, location. You can imagine like very easily, and you've moved around the country, right? As have I. The US is a wildly diverse place
Yeah.
culturally, right? And you can see those different values at play. And I think you can see people move from region to region and see those values start to adjust with it as well, which is really kind of related in part to what we're talking about here, right?
Right.
The extent to which you're aligned with yourself versus external world or both, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's remarkable how influenced by culture we are, whether it's the culture of our family, our nearest community. And so with students, I hope that we're able to put that lens on and say, like, what values do you hold because of who you are, perhaps distinct and separate from even the influence of culture, but that naturally resonate with you personally and that give
Yep.
you the most aliveness when you embrace those values. You mentioned the distinction between values and strengths and sort of the positive psych framework of VIA. How do you think about strengths when you're do you do a separation? I mean, I understand that like in the positive psych world they're connected, but how do you think about separating them or isolating them and talking about them discretely versus combined?
Yeah, I actually, I mean, I love a lot of the work around VIA, and I think it conflates things a little too much. And so part of the reason I fell into that is, I mentioned to you before, my dissertation was on eudaimonia or eudaimonia, however you want to pronounce it, but it's basically a meaning-based form of well-being. Goes all the way back to Aristotle, right? And so the like ancient definition was essentially um, cultivating one's virtues and then using them to really kind of, I don't know, the polis in ancient Greece, right? Like, how do I give back to the community or sort of to the greater good? That's where we see a lot of that meaning, right? So if I'm coming at it from that sort of philosophical lens, it sounds to me like, what are the things that I think are virtuous, AKA values, right? And then how do I potentially cultivate those things into behaviors, right, in a way that allows me to contribute? So in that case, it might be this thing's really important. I've cultivated it, I'm now using it to contribute. That seems like a strength.
Mm.
That's a little different from, you and I were both athletes, right? It's a little different from, well, I'm a pretty good soccer player and you're a pretty good baseball player. Those are
Right.
strengths. Are they virtuous? Do they contribute? It depends, on the context of those sorts of things. But hopefully that kind of distinguishes a little bit. You could have a strength in your personality that is not necessarily a virtue or contributory, right? But you could also have these like virtues that you believe in that you don't actually develop into strengths or use or apply in some way, right? I think the best case scenario is values, virtues developed, cultivated into behaviors that I then can execute, get that sense of resonance,
Right.
coherence, congruence from.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. And when I started thinking of my own journey of identifying my strengths, there was a couple things that came up for me too. I was thinking about what's the connection between strengths and passion, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
is there anything in that ground? Like, what role does passion play in our resonance was another question that came to mind. Um, Third question I forgot, so I'm going to start with that with those two again.
Yeah, no, let's talk about passion a little
Yeah.
bit, right? So it gets thrown around a lot. You and I spent a lot of time in LA. I don't know if you ever got exposed to Sir Ken Robinson. He's
Yeah. Oh,
got
yeah.
the most popular TED Talk of all time, the late Sir Ken Robinson. He's one of his early books and the work in the TED Talk. It's called Do Schools Kill Creativity for listeners. It's an awesome TED Talk. He's a hilarious dude. His early book was called The Element. It was basically describing passion, right? And the way he described it there was kind of these things that light you up, right? And that give you energy, and that maybe motivate you. And in my dissertation, we would describe these potentially as like autotelic experiences. They, in and of themselves, are the reward, right? They're not necessarily done for the thing that comes after. It's okay if something comes after that, but that's not necessarily why you do it, right? And so, for instance, again, with athletes, you and I probably enjoyed playing the game. Do you want to win? Sure. Does that take away passion for the game if you don't, or playing the game? Probably not, right? And so it gets used in this way, I think, somewhat generally. But if you dig into the science, there's actually like multiple subtypes of passion. And so let's do a little juxtaposition. What's just on the other side of passion? Mania,
Right.
right? And so and this comes with congruence, if a passion, right, is not what we would call in the science harmonious, so lots of pleasant affect, lots of intrinsic drive, lots of probably sense of congruence, right? That'd be harmonious passion. There can also be basically obsessive passion. And it makes me think we just on Flourish FM, we had on Isra Nasir, and she's got a book out called Toxic Productivity. And I bet now I'm saying it as I realize it, right?
Right.
That is basically compulsive doing. And a lot of times it's compulsive because we maybe don't feel accepted. So imagine I am obsessively passionate about a particular job because I'm trying to prove something to daddy,
Right.
whatever. I'm trying to feel accepted by this community, right? Those are not the same types of passion, right? There's also role-based passion. This makes me think of you and probably a lot of the people in your network. What would you guess is probably one of the roles out there in the world that just people seem to lend themselves to or feel really passionate about, regardless of the topic or entity? They just like doing this sort of thing. They're this sort of person. They're this sort of personality. Well, what do you think that is, if you had to guess?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. What is it?
It's entrepreneurs.
Hmm.
It's entrepreneurs. And so now that I say it, it's like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
How many times have you met somebody that's like, yeah, you ain't a school person
Hmm.
and you ain't a work for somebody else person?
Right.
There is something innate about your personality and your tendencies and your interests that lend themselves to role-based passion. I just love being an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
The idea doesn't matter. The product doesn't matter. I love the process of being an entrepreneur. I'm passionate about that and solving problems. So these are ways you can start breaking down passion a little bit more granularly.
It's so interesting, in our work with founders at the Founder Mental Health Pledge, you mentioned that line between passion and mania. And I
Yes.
see it so often,
Yes.
and then there's the other thing that you were just talking about, which I think is so important for students in particular, younger people, which is that line between our passion being innate to us versus our passion being aimed at something external, whether it's a reward
Mhm.
system, whether it's, how people will perceive us. And so many entrepreneurs I work with, there's a really fuzzy line there where all of a sudden the thing that they were passionate about organically doing gets contorted, even in my own lived experience, where all of a sudden you have investors and you have the press, and you start losing connection with something that might be true for you, and now it's for others, right? And so I think that's so interesting that you just kind of touched on those different threads. And I think for young people, if I could offer to my younger self the thing that I would most want, and this work is really rooted in that, it's like, let's orient you from a place of congruence or truth for you, and then build a life around that versus figure out how to fit you into the boxes that society presents you with, or the reward system that society presents you with, and see if we can keep people. And so when I think of that, I also think, so in the framework of resonance, then, there's an interesting phenomenon for me where once we start gravitating towards things that are for others or for external systems, I think we lose some potency or saliency as an individual in how we are expressed in the world. It's almost like a contorting lens. Have you worked with any students or even executives or high performing athletes where they struggle with this line of what's innately passion for them versus kind of getting trapped in that externalized
All the
world?
time, all the time, right? And there's a reason for that, right? And there's probably a lot of reasons for that, but we could sort of ask the question: is passion always a good thing?
Right.
Right. And you made a good point, right? If passion isn't there, if it's being done, so let's use some motivation language. If passion is intrinsic drive, right? Autotelic, it's self-organizing. I like doing the thing because of the thing versus extrinsic. I'm doing the thing because of what's going to come after. Reward, punishment, whatever it might be. Well, there's a place for both, right? Like, sure, if you're doing something outside of a passion, could that potentially take energy? Yeah, but I know a lot of people who are like, yeah, but I need a boss. I need a team. I need somebody to answer to or respond to. Like, because if it's just, do I want to do it? It ain't going to get done all the time.
Right.
But if I have to do it, right, that can provide energy and motivation as well. And so I think it's not so much an either or as it really can be kind of a both and.
Right.
Right. And so this is a good connection to well being because I mentioned eudaimonia. So that's meaning based happiness. It oftentimes comes with sacrifice, right? So you can think of like passion, if it's harmonious passion, if it's sort of like unmitigated, pleasant emotion and affect, well, that sounds really hedonistic, right? And there's something to be said to that. Yeah, sorry, hedonism is pleasure-based happiness as opposed to meaning-based happiness, right? And so, okay, should I have some hedonism? Should I have some passion? Should I have a lot of positive affect? Sure. But should that be the only thing, or should I develop parts of my being and my capacity to be disciplined when I need to be, to sacrifice when I need to be, and to find ways to contribute to the greater good, whatever the greater is for that
Right.
particular individual, right? Even if they're outside of my passion. And you kind of alluded to that earlier, right? Is if you take a passion and you say, okay, I'm going to turn it into my job, you really do run the risk of like stopping it from being a passion, right? It shifts from want to do to have to do, right? And so sometimes for many people, it's, hey, let's not try to merge intrinsic and extrinsic. Let's not try to merge passion with your job. Let's just make sure you have other outlets so that you can have your job for the various reasons you have your job. And you can also have these hobbies, these interests and passions.
Right.
Some people marry them fine. I think I'm an example of one of them, right? Like a lot of the things I do, I like doing. I've always liked doing. I've gotten sort of lucky that way. I told you last time I knew I wanted to do a lot of these things really early in life.
Yeah.
That ain't the case for most people. Passion tends to be developed, not discovered. The whole, Tiger Woods, I knew from 2 years old, I wanted to be like the greatest golfer of all time. That's a dope story. It is the outlier. It is not the general rule, right? I'm thinking of the Steve Jobs commencement speech at Stanford in 2005, right? Passion is ultimately about dots connecting in ways that bring together interests and strengths and motivations and right those sorts of things. You have to collect dots
Right.
if they're going to connect, right? And so there's got to be a discovery period, and sometimes that discovery period will happen in your, teens, 20s, 30s, but it could be happening while you're working, while you're doing these other things. And so hopefully it just gives you, I think there's a both and to a lot of this, right?
Yeah, yeah, I love that speech, and I love that sort of the conclusion is like the dots connect looking backwards, not always
Yes.
forward, right? And
Yes.
um, I think it's such an interesting exploration for young people because to understand how these pieces come together to form resonance, but also sort of a recognition that to kind of set them up for the and jobs always use the framework of curiosity, but to almost live curious, with curiosity as you go and kind of start collecting pieces. It's like, oh, I now know my values. I thought these were my values, and as I go, I'm actually starting to see this one becoming more and more important. Or I thought I was passionate about this, but I'm also discovering a whole thing I'd never been exposed to. And I
Yes.
think, um,
Yes. And
you
it,
know,
and it could be curiosity. So it's worth thinking about the scale here that you bringing up curiosity, because this was another part of my research. Curiosity is maybe the starting point. Well, then the development is that might go into interest, and then it's situational interest, and then it's sustained interest, and then it's potentially starting to get into passion and things like that, right? So curiosity and intuition, I totally agree, are really excellent places to start, and just to continue the story of Jobs, which hate them, love them, Apple, whatever it might be. I'm not trying to get into all that, but like, here's the fact of the matter. When he dropped out of Reed College, and you know this from the story, right? He started going to get free meals at a temple. Well,
yeah,
if you ever read his biography later in life, he became a Zen Buddhist, right? And I would argue that is part of why he had a brilliant design mind, right? Like as the story goes, right or wrong, you could drop an iPhone probably into, some place where people had never seen technology, and they could probably figure it out because of the application of Zen Buddhist principles to how he designed products, right? He talked about going into Reed's calligraphy class. You and I are similar in age, right? I know in middle school, we'd go into computer labs to work on like typing speed. And for us, there was always a fight over PCs or Macintosh. In those days, it was Mac, right? Why did everybody want the Mac? Had cool fonts.
yeah,
Why did it have cool fonts? Why was it the first PC to have cool fonts or different fonts? Because Jobs was into calligraphy,
yeah.
right? He didn't look at those things and say, well, this is going to make me money or this is going to be super practical. He followed curiosity and intuition. They developed into interest. Later on, those dots connected.
Yeah, yeah. There's another part about resonance. I was thinking about as you're talking about Jobs, another curiosity, and this isn't even in our framework, but it just emerged as a curiosity in our conversation. Uh, I'm sure the people that you coach have dreams or visions for themselves. Like they have like kind of a North Star that they'd like to move towards. Do you ever excavate that landscape? Like what are your dreams, what are your hopes, what are your visions for yourself? How does that end up coming into play when you think about a person's resonance, let's say?
If they don't have that, to me, it's the starting point.
Mm,
Always. You always want to personalize, right? Everyone's a little different. But if they don't know that, my general response or question to them would be, are you living randomly or are you living on purpose?
mm,
Right? We use it in a lot of our talks. There's a famous Yogi Berra quote about like, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up nowhere, or something along those lines. I'm slaughtering it, but like, you've got to have some sort of destination in mind. Now, here's a little bit of attention and a little bit of a paradox, right? Because if we're saying, okay, you need to know, for instance, like what your recipe for flourishing or happiness is,
mhm.
yeah, I agree with that. Does that mean you should set out with the goal of raising your happiness? Well, we got some pretty good research that suggests that might actually have the opposite effect. So, what it is like, what are the ingredients that I generally want to have present in my life? Because more often than not, they're going to lead to the meal that is going to be satisfactory, right? And then how do I interact with those ingredients, cook with those ingredients, to extend the metaphor, whatever it might be. But that's not the same thing as, hey, Dr. Holton, like I'm not like super happy these days or satisfied. Can we raise those levels? a lot of times they're coming in, I'm not really sure, what I value or what I care about. And so then when you start putting the ingredients in front of them, number one predictor, social connection. Number two predictor, meaning, right? Pleasant emotion, but emotional richness, deep engagement, vitality, a lot of the things we're going to talk about within real. Then they have to say, and this is a simple example, give them all those ingredients, right? Where do you sit right now? Scale of 0 to 10, right? And they'll rate it. We usually tell them, listen, if you're a 7 or 8, that's pretty high, because most people aren't saying 9s and 10s, right? These areas couldn't improve. So 7s and 8s are pretty high. But what that inevitably reveals is when they find 6s, 5s, or lower, it kind of identifies like, oh, this is important to me, but I haven't been paying a whole lot of attention to it. Maybe I need to be more intentional here, right, to kind of develop that overall recipe. And so there's a lot of different things we do. That's one exercise. Best future self is an exercise. Like, how am I going to feel? What's going to be different? Very, very vivid visualization of that future self, right? All of those things are important. And because we're talking about resonance, there's sometimes I think a fine line between having those goals or dreams and desires and being rigid about those goals, dreams, and desires. And in some cases, rigidity helps a lot of people. In some cases, it creates a lot of suffering.
Right, right. That's so interesting. As you were talking, a curiosity also popped up for me, which is, what role when you're working with a coaching client, when I work with CEOs, I was struck by Tasha Eurich's work around self-awareness, sort of the most simplistic 2 by 2, but a combination of like how well connected you are with how you're seeing yourself, but also like how other people experience you and what role do other people have in helping you hone in on your own resonance. And how do you think about that in terms of getting feedback from others, getting reflection? Like, what is the process that a young person could go through to hone in on the most resonant version of themselves with another person?
It's so complicated to a
Hmm.
certain extent, and I'll simplify it. But the reason I think it's so complicated is there's kind of like what are my values, right? And those should indicate or sort of encourage certain behaviors. And then you just made the point, right? Those behaviors will land with other people in certain ways, and they may see you a certain way, they may respond to you a certain way, right? And in those moments, it could be, well, I am who I am, take it or leave it, right? And that's one extreme. Another extreme might be it's kind of a version of simping, right? It's like, I will just be whoever you want me to be,
Right.
right? And to me, the kind of healthy place is not necessarily somewhere in between, but consistently grappling with both of those things. So,
Hmm.
let's take an example, right? I haven't been feeling well all week. We went out to dinner last night. I still wasn't feeling well. On the way home, I was snappy with my wife, right? She was snappy with me in return. Like, we both end up apologizing. But like, imagine if I did that and then was just like, well, sorry, babe, I am who I am.
Right.
Right? Like, what an asshole, that sort of thing. But at the same time, does that mean I should lose all sense of core, right? And like who I am based on her responses to me?
Right.
I don't think so, right? Now, here's the trick of all of it. None of that matters if you don't have the awareness of self, but you also don't have mechanisms like I don't know that I have huge or high emotional intelligence, but I'm going to say this anyway. I think quite badly for people who I know do not,
Hmm.
because they cannot read those signs. They cannot get that information. And it is a good example of like people who tend to be kind of on the spectrum, right? Or twice exceptional, wildly cognitively intelligent, have trouble picking up on certain social cues, facial expressions, whatever it might be, right? So there's the question of, should I, right, behave in sort of certain ways? But before that, there's even, can I get the data? Can I read the facial expression, get the language, hear the tone, and then maybe to your question, or do I have systems and processes that allow me to ask people or get that feedback, right? And the simple example there is always in a professional setting, asking colleagues, bosses, whatever it might be. But a lot of times with clients, we'll say, listen, reach out to friends, reach out to family, like people you trust to not BS you.
Right.
And to tell you, in education, we call it a warm demander. Right? You know they love you, you know they support you, and part of that is they're going to let you know when your shit stinks.
The demanding part being, I'm going to demand that you be the best version of yourself, or the
Yeah, in part because I know you want to be.
right, right, and it's a form of love in an interesting way.
Correct.
Yeah,
Correct. Yeah, not manipulation, not you should be how I want you to be. Right. It's I think you want to be this way. You're not being that way. I'm gonna call it out.
yeah, that's so interesting. When I'm talking to young people going, college to college, what I find really fascinating, I think this is a generational thing, part of what I hope educators are able to do. The young people are not getting a lot of reflection or feedback unless they're in like a sports team or something. But in general, with regards to who they might be and what makes them, the most unique version of themselves, I find this overwhelming thirst for a better understanding of, is it okay to be me? What's the best version of me? How am I seen by others? And it's this strange phenomenon where at the same time, they're spending a disproportionate amount of time thinking about how they're presenting to the external world on social media and how other people are presenting. And so it's a strange thing where it's a world of presentation for other. And yet I think there's this deep thirst for more feedback and reflection. And so just an interesting thing for us to note as we work with young people. And I don't know if when I say that anything comes up for you.
Well, it comes back to context, right? And I mentioned this earlier that values can change with context, but there's also, like we talked about values and strengths. Strengths are contextual, and the way we feel about our strengths are contextual. And so I don't want to harp on sports too much, but like you and I being both reasonably athletic, pretty fortunate we were born in the United States. There are
Right.
plenty of places that don't give a damn about that, right? Let alone our sports, soccer and baseball, right? Um, if you are, let's say, so we'll take the flip side. You know, I'm semi-academic and do a lot of stuff online and those sorts of things. If like shit hit the fan and all of a sudden like the tech grid went down and I had to kind of be my own, like I didn't have YouTube videos to farm my own food and be my own mechanic and fix my own stuff, like I wouldn't have a whole lot of value. Right. In those cases, it's, hey, Nick, like your psychology degree is fine, but that doesn't help us here, right? Whereas like right now, and you see this a lot in the political polarization, right? This is basically the tension between, the coast and I need to find a better phrase, but the flyover states. And I say that being from one, just
Sure.
so people hear that. You are too, right? And so I think like that's kind of the dance you're always doing is okay, I think these are strengths. I'm good with these things, but if they're not valued, it's kind of hard to get that positive reinforcement sometimes too, right? It's not always about, hey, I think you're screwing up and I think you should do this. Sometimes it's just not getting the positive.
Right, right, yeah. Well, and there's an interesting thing, I think, with this generation also, in terms of being valued, where more than ever before, a creative life is, potentially monetizable, but also the hardest thing to monetize at the same time. And so I think a lot of this generation's drawn towards creative
Yes.
work, self-expression work, and yet finding value for that becomes one of the biggest challenges, finding enough feedback and reflection, and then even knowing how the game is played well enough to develop it into a career. So it's an interesting time. One of the last things with resonance that I get real curious about is personality, right? And so I'm curious about different frameworks for personality. I think a little bit about like five factor or different things. Like what have
Big
you
five. Yeah.
found? Or I'm sorry, big five. Yeah.
No, it
Um,
gets you that way too. Yeah. Yeah.
it's an interesting thing. How much does that play into your work with individuals? What have you learned about the dimension of personality? What's interesting for us to explore down the road?
Yeah. So it's a good question. I'm familiar with a lot of the research on personality. I would not characterize myself as someone who's great about trying to work with certain personality profiles to match them to certain environments, because in part, while I think that's useful, um, that also, to me, sometimes kind of boxes people into what they believe they are and are destined to be.
Mm,
And again, there's a both and a fine line here a little bit, right? Like, okay, yes, DNA is a thing, genetics is a thing. I am born with, what the phrase is, genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger,
mm,
right? I am born with certain probabilities, let's say, and certain personality traits. But those things, I don't think they're totally changeable, but they are malleable to a certain extent. We can do certain things about them. So generally in the work we do, we would point people towards the big five. I think that's the most sort of robust, well-validated kind of personality profile at this point. We would not ever send them to Myers-Briggs for listeners. Get that crap out of here. That's like business acronym jargon. Not a lot of validity behind it. But it's really about, listen, here's kind of your tendencies, your disposition, right? Here's the way you generally tend to think and behave based on what we've seen from these surveys or what you've told us sort of anecdotally, qualitatively, right? Now, let's ask some questions and explore about how you might take those and leverage them in different contexts, right? And it's not either or, and are there elements of it that you would like to try to tweak or refine in some way, shape, or form? Right. So simple examples like we were talking about this earlier in the week, right? I'm not a super patient guy. I'm not proud of that. I don't feel good about that. It creates problems here and there, right? That's something I consistently am trying to shift a little bit while also not necessarily punishing myself for not being able to do a 180 on it.
right.
Right? Because there's, like when I look at it, my late grandpa, pretty impatient too. My dad, he's gotten so much better. But when I was young, he had those moments as well, right? And so there's where you can see some of the genetics, some of the like disposition, but there's always something we can try to do to shift it a little bit.
Yeah, genetics loaded that gun for you. Um,
Yes, they did.
what I love about this is I think the opportunity is to just bring into awareness these concepts, right? And to be able to
Yes.
put dots on the board as you go, explore how they feel for you, how they work for you, how other people experiencing them in you. And um, I think what we'll do for today, just broad kind of revisit our hope here. So we're just going to go through different conversations today. We covered resonance and we'll move into energy and anti-fragility and liberation. But I think we put some dots on the board, to use the same analogy today, that I'd love to double click with you on as we go deeper on resonance in the future. But it's a really interesting conversation. Are you have anything else that's present for you, or like any reflections after just chatting briefly about resonance?
I'll say something like I think is pretty simple and hopefully people can take with them. Whether you're talking about resonance, congruence, coherence, alignment, whatever it might be. And this is another good example of the utility of unpleasantness. Not always, but many times, if you behave in ways that are outside of values, right, or not in alignment with how you want to behave going forward, generally what happens in that scenario, we feel like crap. And usually when that happens, I would say, good. That's telling you something,
Mhm.
right? And what it's probably telling you is you're probably a little out of alignment with how you want to behave. Do you know how you want to behave? Do you know what those values are? Do you have tools and strategies, mechanisms to try to behave or live that way a little bit more going forward? But, I think when like guilt's a good example, not shame. Shame's global. Me as a human, guilt is local, right? A particular experience. But anytime, I don't know about you, but anytime I felt guilty, it has usually been very precise in terms of how I felt about how I behaved versus how I wish I would have behaved.
Right.
That sucks, but that is part of the utility of being able to endure and accept unpleasant experiences. They're teachers sometimes.
That's awesome. Well, what you're talking about too that comes up for me is like this linkage now between resonance and then how we feel. And that starts
Yes.
moving us into energy, which we'll cover next week, which I think is physiological, emotional, and just the dimensions you just kind of laid out. This bridge between how resonant we are with ourselves and our being, extending into energy and sort of our our ways of being and ways of feeling. And so I'm excited for that conversation next week, and
Same,
appreciate the time today. Good to spend some time on it.
same here.
All right, great.